Welcome to Literacy Talks, the podcast for literacy leaders and champions everywhere, brought to you by Reading Horizons. Literacy Talks is the place to discover new ideas, trends, insights, and practical strategies for helping all learners reach reading proficiency. Our hosts are Stacy Hurst, a professor at Southern Utah University and Chief Academic Advisor for Reading Horizons. Donell Pons, a recognized expert and advocate in literacy, dyslexia, and special education. And Lindsay Kemeny, an elementary classroom teacher, author, and speaker. Now, let's talk literacy.
Welcome to this episode of Literacy Talks. For those of you who've been listening this season, you know that we are highlighting the Perspectives 75th anniversary issue of that publication. And exciting news today. We have a very awesome guest. And I'm going to turn the time over to Donell to introduce her because Donell, you are the one that made the connection for us. So.
Great. Yes, we are just so pleased to have Dr. Louise Spear-Swerling with us today on the podcast. And obviously, if you've been following along and looking at the Perspectives publication, the one Stacy said is the 75th anniversary edition, and there's a free download at the IDA website, the International Dyslexia Association website. So if you haven't looked at it and you would like to, you can for free. You don't have to subscribe. And then if you have been following along, then you'll be delighted because you've either read the article or you are aware that she is one of the authors of an article. So this will be a fun discussion today. And I'm just going to put a personal thing in there. I've listened to you for years, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the way that you break things down. And I know that other educators feel the same way. I'm not the only one. You do a really good job of helping things that seem rather overwhelming, maybe a little difficult, lots of moving parts. You make them very approachable and understandable. And that's one of the things I think is just so good about your work, among many other things.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
You bet. You do a great job with that. And so, Louise, I think we'd just like to start off by having you tell us a little bit about your background. You've been around a while, but you might be new to some people, and some of us might not understand your whole background. Tell us how you got into this field and give us a little bit of that story.
Sure. Well, my father was a special educator. And so that kind of gave me exposure to the field. The field was very different in his day, and his specialty was not learning disabilities. But I saw how committed he was to his work, how important his work was to him. And that, when I was casting about in my early 20s for something that I wanted to do as a career, that had a big influence on me. And then I was very fortunate. I've been a really lucky woman in lots of ways. So I went to a teacher prep program that was in my area. And this was a really long time ago, like the late 70s. And I was prepared to teach what we would now call structured literacy, which was very unusual for its time. But the woman that headed the program, Elizabeth Gallistel, was very familiar with the Haskins Laboratories researchers like Isabel Liberman and Donald Shankweiler. She knew a lot of the early icons of what we would now call science of reading. And that really shaped the program. So I was very fortunate to have that preparation. And then I went into public schools to teach. I taught at an elementary level. And then when I decided to go into a doctoral program, I decided to go into a cognitive psychology program because I wanted a broader background. And at the time I started my program, it was just pure serendipity. All of this research on the importance of phonemic awareness in reading, but also cognitive strategies in comprehension, all of that was coming out. And along the way, I was really fortunate to have some great mentors, not only Betty, but my doctoral advisor, Bob Sternberg. Louisa Motes was a really important mentor to me early in my career, Hollis Scarborough. So, I was really fortunate. I think back sometimes and think, boy, the career could have gone a completely different way if I had had a different teacher prep program and didn't have the mentoring I had or had different people influencing me.
Well, that is so great. I love hearing that history. And I appreciate even more now that because you did, as you say, you got lucky with serendipity, that you ended up with these folks who had such good information for you, put you on the right path, so to speak, on the science of reading, that you've been generous to share it with us, because that's what we're relying on, right? Is if we haven't heard, others will help, right?
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Pitch in and help each other out. So, Louise, this edition has been fantastic. Give us a little overview of your article, because you're in the section of how do we do this? And so tell us a little bit about what you wanted to accomplish with the article, and then we'll get into some of the aspects.
Sure. So a lot of the discussion about, like science of reading and concerns that people have about reading instruction, a lot of those concerns have focused on what the issue frames as the what. So the idea that it's important to teach phonemic awareness and phonics, or there's not enough emphasis on spelling or written expression. But how you teach is just as important. The what is really important. It is important that we address those areas. But if you teach ample phonics, but you do it in an ineffective way, that's not so good. So how you teach is also important. So that was the focus of my article.
Yeah, and I think you do such a good job. We'll dive right into that. And I think it's important as you note. So if you're reading this Perspectives publication, make sure you do hit all those areas, because as you've pointed out, they give you a different viewpoint as to why something is important, but you need everything, right, to have a full understanding. So your article in particular was titled "The How of Structured Literacy," just as important as the what, like you've just said. And it is fantastic. It gives us a snapshot of really how you make this all come together. But what I loved is how you start the article. It was really great because it's very, very approachable. And you said at the beginning, you recounted an experience at a conference, which I'm sure is not unusual, where a teacher educator was learning about the implementation of structured literacy. And they asked, I think this is something we've all probably heard, how is this new? We already prepared candidates to teach phonics. And then tell us what your response was. It was really
that teacher educator, that had happened like the week before I sat down to write the article. So it was fresh in my mind, although, as you say, it's not an unusual experience. And and she was, obviously not one of the most persuadable people in the audience. But she was really focused on the what. That they already do this. We already teach phonics, and what's the big deal? And she was probably right. I think most, teacher prep programs do teach at least some phonics, but how it's taught is also really important. And that was the point I tried to make in my response. So, are children being taught phonics in an explicit, systematic way, or is the teaching kind of incidental and haphazard? Is the phonics teaching well integrated with spelling and the books that children have to read, or is it kind of a separate carve out in literacy, but it's not really integrated? A big problem I see with a lot of phonics teaching is that many teachers have not been trained to give good feedback when children are reading text. So even if phonics is being taught, when children are reading text, if the teacher just gives them the word or encourages them to guess based on pictures, based on sentence context, it kind of undermines the phonics teaching. So all of those were points that I tried to make in my response to this person. I'm not sure I won her over, but but I tried.
I think I really appreciate that too about the articles, because as you're hitting on these touch points, you speak to each one of these in the article. So if there are people listening and they're saying, oh gosh, I wish I could. Yeah, it's in the article. So we encourage you, even after this conversation, you're going to want to go back and review. And it's nice to have a little roadmap to remind you of the conversation that we've had today. I think that's really great. And structured literacy is interesting because often it's emphasizing the explicit systematic instruction. And your article explores that really well for us, the systematic. And sometimes even when you say it, I'm not sure people really understand what that means. Can you help us with that a little bit?
Sure. Explicit means the skills are being taught directly by the teacher. Children are not expected to infer them only from exposure, with, careful choice of examples, clear modeling, and guided practice. Systematic means that within a domain of literacy, like phonics, comprehension, composition, you're building from simple to complex. So it is important to make the point that these different domains of literacy are being taught in tandem with each other. We're not expecting children to totally master phonics before they get to work on comprehension, right? But within the domain, you're building from simple words, decoding simple words to increasingly complex words. Within the domain of comprehension, you'd be building from, easier to comprehend types of texts, maybe easier vocabulary and concepts, and then sort of building gradually over time. And the same thing with composition. We don't expect children to write, a lengthy, complex piece of writing if they can't even write a paragraph yet. So that's really what systematic means.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because, Louise, you're talking about, and if this feels like it's makes a lot of sense to a lot of people who teach in different fields, it does make a lot of sense because it's really a good practice, isn't it?
Sure.
At heart,
sure.
right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So there, I think oftentimes I can start a conversation with someone who's maybe reluctant and maybe, what's the structured literacy you speak of? And sometimes you can build a bridge right there because that speaks to people who have an understanding of how you might teach a concept if you want to teach
That's
it.
right. And sometimes people, do have misconceptions, which I think is probably true of the story about the teacher educator that I began the article with. They have the misconception that, oh, you're saying all we need to teach is phonics, or we have to drill phonics and children don't get to work on anything else in literacy. That's not true. But within a particular component or domain, you do want to build from simple to complex, because otherwise many children, there's always children that no matter how you teach, they learn, right? They're resilient to the teaching approach, probably because they come into the classroom with those skills already in place. But for the children who have any sort of vulnerability, they're not, if you throw things at them that involve prerequisite skills that they don't have, it's very overwhelming and really increases the odds of failure. So I think of structured literacy as an approach that tries really hard to avoid unintentionally confusing children, and that also teaches in a way that's efficient as well as effective. So, some of these skills like spelling or phonics skills, children might infer it from exposure if you just wait long enough, but it's not a very efficient way to learn important skills. And efficiency is really important if a child is already behind and you have to catch them up.
Right. Yeah. Such a good a base in which to do that. So, Louise, you brought up something interesting that I'd like to touch on because it was a really good way of putting it. And that is the integration. So like you're saying, we're not expecting a student to be a master of one of these domains, but rather integrating as we go is a good way in order to teach, right? The best way to teach. And I'm just thinking about the work of other researchers like Linnea Erie and others with developmental information that would be useful and helpful, right? To inform.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, all of the people that, were in the co-contributors to the issue. Many of them were really important influences on me in my own career. Linnea's model of word reading was one of the things I wrote about really early in my work, and that really shaped my thinking about reading problems. Reed Lyon, Kate Kane. There were so many wonderful people, and also the editors were fabulous. Barbara Wilson and Jessica Hammond. So those were all people that were big influences on me. And I think you can see when you look at the articles, if you look at the issue as a whole, there's commonalities that sort of run through. So the abilities that are important in learning to read, people are emphasizing different abilities because that's what they're writing about. But everybody has an agreement on what kinds of abilities are important in learning to read. Nobody's writing about word configuration cues or word shapes or, things like that, because the research does not support that that's important in learning to read. And I think another commonality is a shared belief in the power of instruction to help children who have reading difficulties. There's no question that there are children who come to school with a certain vulnerability that might come from lack of experience or an intrinsic disability, but we know a lot now about how to help these children, and all of the writers for the issue, I think, have a shared belief in that, the power of that to help children.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. I remember we had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Motes once, and she said, when there's understanding, then you all get behind and the work goes easily, because you have a shared understanding. And so for a first grade teacher listening right now, and Lindsay, you are a first grade teacher.
Yeah, what would be something to take away from the article?
Yeah,
well,
strategy.
Lindsay sounds like she's, a great teacher, so she probably doesn't need this advice. But I think for many teachers, if they don't have a strong background in reading, looking at certain assessments to help target instruction. So, for example, you mentioned a first grade teacher. For a first grade teacher, looking at criterion reference types of phonics measures, like the core phonics survey, the GE test, there's other measures too, but the kind of measures where words are organized into different phonics categories. So you have, and they're ordered in complexity. So you have the simplest word types, CVC words, and then short vowel words with digraphs, short vowel words with blends, and then kind of building up to long words, like words of 2 syllables or more. So that's one way that a teacher could get a handle on, okay, what are the specific phonics skills that I need to teach? And then another example of a good assessment for first grade are CBM measures of oral reading fluency, like Dibbles or Ames Web or Acadian. Some of these measures are available for free download from the web. And for a first grader, you wouldn't usually start the ORF assessment, the oral reading fluency assessment, until the middle of first grade. But in the second half of first grade, that type of assessment, these measures. So for people that might not be familiar with the measure, what children are asked to do is read a passage aloud. And it turns out that that's a really good predictor of overall reading competence at the elementary level, about up through grade 5 or so. And the teacher scores both the percentage of words read correctly and also words correct per minute. And ideally, look for a CBM that gives you separate benchmarks for those two things. So if you have a student who meets the benchmark for accuracy, but not for rate, for words correct per minute, then that's a student who just needs to work on fluency. And that would be very common at a first grade level. So having the student get more practice reading text, reading connected text like short stories and passages and things like that. But if you have a child who's not meeting the benchmark for accuracy, then you want to work on that first, because you can't build fluency until the student is accurate. So again, these are the kinds of measures that are useful because they help the teacher target instruction. You can have great, instructional programs or teaching methods, but if it's not really targeted to what the student needs, it's not going to be helpful.
Yeah.
And I can answer your question too, Donell. For something I think is important to take away from this article for first grade teachers, there was a part I highlighted and starred, and it says students do not need to master the foundational skills of word recognition before developing their comprehension abilities. And I think that's really important for us lower grade teachers because, of course, we have so much focus now on that, phonics and building those foundational skills, but we can still be working on the other ones right from the beginning. And a lot of that is with read aloud and building vocabulary and discussions and oral language and all of that.
Absolutely. I think for teachers to, a lot of the teachers I've met, they have the idea that read alouds with young children, that's, kind of a warm, fuzzy thing you do to motivate reading. And it is partly, but also, especially if it's combined with explicit teaching about the meanings of words and, other areas of language, it's also got an important instructional purpose.
Yeah, I loved that you called that out so nicely in the article.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Interested in diving deeper into today's episode and exploring more literacy topics? Join us in the Science of Reading Collective, where we host the Literacy Talks podcast chat. It's the perfect place to share insights, ask questions, and keep the conversation going. But that's just the beginning. When you join the Science of Reading Collective, you're stepping into a vibrant, dynamic community explicitly designed for literacy champions like you. Access decodable texts, sound wall resources, and professional learning in our AI-enhanced community, all brought to you absolutely free. Find us at collective.readinghorizons.com. Join the Science of Reading Collective today and be part of a movement that's eradicating illiteracy. That's collective.readinghorizons.com.
And Louise, you also did another thing. You give great profiles. You will take a student, you'll give a profile of a student, and then give some strategies, which I think is always so helpful. But it's some of the best that I've seen when you break it down, because you're really able to picture this student. So talk to us a little bit about, and you did some within the article, which were great. You can choose those two to highlight if you'd like, but you give some sort of differences between just a student who might be having a general challenge with some things and just needs support, and probably tier one and how you approach your teaching there will be just enough, versus a student who does have some real challenges with reading and what you might do.
So I would say there's like kind of two concepts here that are important. So one has to do with the poor reader's profile. So that's something I've been really interested in my work. And I keep trying to get it into education more, but my success is, not as great as I would like. But for your listeners that are, many of them are probably familiar with the simple view of reading, right? Which says that good reading comprehension depends on two broad types of abilities: being able to read the words and having good language comprehension. So the profiles kind of flow out of that. The poor reader profiles are basically three different profiles. There's the student who has trouble only with reading the words, but language comprehension is good, or the student who only has trouble with language comprehension, which in turn will affect reading comprehension, but their word reading is at grade level or better. And then the student that has trouble with both types of things, right? And any of these students could be a student with a disability. The profile is not about whether or not a student has a disability. It's about their pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So for instance, in the type of profile that's called a specific reading comprehension difficulty, a student could have limitations in their language comprehension because they have a language disability, but they could also just lack exposure. Like many English learners have that kind of profile, not because they have a disability necessarily, but because they haven't had exposure to English vocabulary and academic language. So what I would encourage teachers to do is first think about the profile. And this is other people that certainly have written a lot about this, like Hugh Katz is one of the people that's written about this a lot in his research. Don Compton, a book that I just published called The Structured Literacy Planner is built around poor reader profiles. So
which I'm just going to say is great. I'm just going to give you a plug. It's fantastic.
Oh,
yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. So think about the profile first. And then, as you know, researchers like Jack Fletcher have pointed out, what really works best, instead of having a test, then teach model in identification of disabilities, first teach, then do more of the testing. So, the initial testing should focus on how do you understand the student's strengths and weaknesses, the profile, because that tells you, well, do I need to teach decoding? Do I need to teach comprehension? Do I need to intervene in those areas? And then the student's responsiveness to the intervention tells you whether there might be a disability. So students with disabilities typically need much more intensity than students who don't have disabilities. Students who have disabilities will learn too, but they often need a smaller group size, more opportunities for practice, more opportunities to respond. So if your school has, a tiered intervention type of model, the children who respond to to tier 2 are probably students, if they're showing evidence that they're on a trajectory to catch up, they're probably not the students who have disabilities. The students who really need something more, who just don't, it's just not enough intensity for them, or they keep forgetting, or they keep falling back behind other students, that's more likely to be a student who has some sort of disability. If it's, if the profile is difficulty with decoding and phonological skills, that's more like a student with dyslexia. If they have a broader pattern of difficulty, but that is resistant to intervention, then that might be a student with a developmental language disorder or a mixed reading disability, that type of profile. So sort of, two broad concepts. What's the student's profile? And then how responsive is the student to initial levels of intervention?
And I know you and Stacy were chatting a little bit before I jumped into this podcast. I know you guys are probably talking about pre-service experiences because you both have taught teachers to be teachers and how to do this work in classrooms. And what are some of the challenges that you face when you have a new teacher, a new group of teachers, and you're giving them all of this information? So I'm just thinking, and Stacy, you probably want to have this little conversation too. You guys could have a sidebar about how you prioritize for those educators and what should be their expectation going to that classroom their first year, because I can't imagine how overwhelming it must be, right?
I love the word you just said, prioritizing, because that was one of the most important things I found, both in my work as a teacher educator and also in different policy work, especially here in my state. So I was on a number of panels on, how should teachers teach reading and what kind of test, licensure exam should the teachers take. And after a while, I realized it was pretty easy. That Connecticut likes to bring in people with diverse viewpoints and try to get them to, hold hands and sing Kumbaya, by the end of the panel's work, which didn't always work out too well. But thinking back, it was relatively easy to get people to agree that a certain skill was important. So even the people that were kind of diehard whole language people, they would agree that, yeah, you have to teach some phonics. And certainly even people that were strong advocates of phonics would agree, yes, it's important to teach comprehension. The hard part is prioritization. There's only so many hours in a school day, right? And then by extension, if you take it to the teacher prep classroom at the university level, what are the things that are really important for that first year teacher to know? walking into the classroom for the first time. And it does mean you have to make you're not going to do everything equally well. There's going to be, a domain of things that you really want to make sure people are prepared. I would argue that's things like formative assessment, using assessment to improve instruction and intervention, understanding things like basic components of reading and how to teach them. And also, of writing, being able to teach spelling and written expression. That's not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the things that would be on my must do list. And then there's some things that, if I'm able to do them, great, like technology. Okay. Some of what's out there in terms of technology, I don't want to make all the tech people mad at me, but is it the number one, the technology is only useful if the teacher's understanding how you use it. And to understand that, you have to have a broader understanding of what abilities are important and how to teach it if you're going to select among good programs. So I think it's, a desirable thing for teachers to learn about, but it's not going to be at the top of my priority list. So, but it's hard. It's a very hard thing. And I remember one time my department chair, who was really a really, really nice person, but she would read books, education relevant books, not textbooks, but things that were, popular books about education. And she would say, oh, you've got to cover this in the 435, which was the course where I taught all of the reading stuff. And I would think like, well, how am I going to cover this book? Because there's no time. There's literally no time. And after a while, I just learned to say to her, if you want me to add something new, you have to tell me what I'm taking out. Am I taking out spelling? Am I taking out assessment? I just can't, I can't add one more thing. And so the prioritization issue is huge. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
And so I want to ask, and Stacy, you can probably speak to this too, and take a little moment here because I know it's one of the challenges. And that is, Louise, do you see things improving at the pre-service level in terms of giving enough attention to how you teach reading to be able to teach our educators who are going to be in classrooms? Is that improving from your perspective? What do you think?
I do think there's improvement. And I'm glad you asked that question because I think it's very important. So, you might have seen the NCTQ does these reviews of teacher prep programs around teaching of elementary level reading. And they did see improvement that was very encouraging. It's not like there's not room for more improvement, but at least in relation to what they had measured previously, there were signs that programs were improving. We've seen efforts in certain states like Mississippi, for example, that really focused on improving teacher prep. We've seen that bear fruit. So I do think that there is improvement. We still have a long way to go to make it more systemic so that you can assume that your child will get a good grounding in reading in the earliest grades, but it's better than it was.
I appreciate that question. And again, the word prioritize comes to mind. I'll just take a minute here to brag about my university. We were one of the universities featured in the last NCTQ report because we did get all the points on all the things. But that being said, it's definitely not oh, good, we've got it going on, we're great. I am keenly aware of all of the things that we still need to add and the time we need to spend on certain things. So there's prioritize. That's the important word for me to remember. And as we're talking about this too, as I read your article, and I mentioned before we started the podcast, I have read your research for decades. Thank you. And I think I need to be more explicit in with my pre-service teachers about integrating pedagogy, knowledge of language, and also how somebody learns to read. Like we need to integrate all of that in our teaching. added, like you're saying, that knowledge of assessment and how we use that and give feedback. I have a question, and I will say in one of my courses, we are using the assess, teach, assess model, and we only have 15 weeks. So we're doing our best. And we do use the assessments in the core phonics survey for one, in the Assessing Reading Multiple Measures book, which is amazing. If anybody,
yes, I agreed.
I recommend it. But one thing that, and now I have given my students guidance on this. In fact, you mentioned Hugh Katz. We did a podcast episode where he mentioned how to notice if somebody is struggling with oral language of young student, but we don't often see assessments that are ubiquitous for oral language with every student. What do you have something that you recommend, or how can I prepare my students to sort of assess that and quantify it? Right now, their assessment is very qualitative.
I don't have a particular assessment of oral vocabulary. I think assessment of these skills orally is really important, because otherwise it's contaminated with decoding, right? So you can't tell if the student gets a low score. Is it because they didn't know the meaning of the word, or they couldn't read the word? When I do a lot of formal evaluations for schools, like independent evaluations. So I will always give like subtests from the Woodcock-Johnson or the Wyatt or something like that. And it's usually like 10 minutes. I mean, it's really quick to do something like a Wyatt, receptive vocabulary and oral discourse comprehension. Maybe more than 10 minutes, but not that bad. It's not that long. But these are not the kind of tests you use in screening of large numbers of kids. For one thing, I think just too expensive for schools to purchase. I believe I have read about, I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but maybe the cubed assessment. There was an assessment I read about recently, but I have not given it myself. So I'm not really familiar with it, but I would scout around and see if you can find something online, because I believe there is something that tests oral vocabulary and listening comprehension. Those are the two things to me that are most important in a screen. And then if you see signs that the child is weak in one or both, then you could always follow up with more in-depth testing of the type that usually a speech pathologist would do.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I know we have had some introduction to OXED that is out of England, of course, but they have a screener. I don't know how accessible it is to the masses.
Actually, I've read about that too, and it looks good. And I mean, the people who developed it are wonderful. So that actually might be the one I was thinking of.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to see what we can do about getting my students at least exposed to that. And then we do teach dialogic reading, which, as I read your article too, I thought all the important things can come together in that moment, right? When you're doing a read aloud, and like you said, it can be a warm, fuzzy moment, but let's make it really intentional as well. And I think in those situations, at least I've noticed from my students, they're more aware of how their students respond and where their oral language may or may not be. So just teaching them, you're always assessing.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, well-informed observation by a teacher, if the teacher knows what kind of things to look for, that could be really powerful, especially as an initial screen. The other thing I always used to tell my students to do, and here in Connecticut, we do emphasize this in terms of, guidelines for identification, for intervention, and for learning disabilities eligibility, is to look at whether the student has a history of early language delay, like kids who have gotten have qualified for birth to 3 because of speech language problems. Many teachers are not aware that even if the children no longer qualify for services when they enter kindergarten, they're still at increased risk of reading problems. So it bears monitoring. It's really worthwhile to monitor those kids more carefully, to make sure that you catch any. They won't all, of course, go on to have reading problems, but a significant percentage do. And you can catch them early if you're monitoring more carefully.
I really appreciate that, because I, the parent of a child who was picked up early, it was never brought up again when we entered the school system. And it was one of those signs, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's my colleague, a former colleague of mine from Southern Institution where I taught full time, Richard Zippoli, has written a lot. He's a speech path who has a strong interest in reading. And he's done some great work in this area on, identification of reading problems early using these signs of, from like early language delay and things like that. Another thing that's kind of a predictor is if there's a history of reading problems in the family, close relatives, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles. And I once did a consultation on a student who had 4 siblings who had all been diagnosed with dyslexia. And the parent was extremely aggressive about making sure that he was identified early. So he was actually identified in kindergarten. And because of the parents' advocacy, he got a lot of intervention very early. And I was called in to evaluate him when he was in 3rd grade to decide whether he needed special ed services anymore. And I'll tell you what I expected to find. I expected to find a student who was a grade level decoder, maybe grade level phonological skills, but lingering problems maybe in spelling or rate of reading, because that would be a common profile. Well, this student, he was like great in everything. And then I thought, well, maybe he never really had a problem to begin with, but the school, I had all his data from the time he was in kindergarten. He really did show signs of phonologic, precursors of dyslexia. And at the PPT, when I said technically he did not meet eligibility criteria, and the parent said to me, well, what do you mean? He had dyslexia and it just went away? And I said, look, what I'm telling you is he looks like a child who really had a strong vulnerability to dyslexia. He got very appropriate intensive intervention right away, and he had a great response to that intervention. And he should be monitored because we know he had this vulnerability. So it's very important to continue close monitoring and kind of know that he might need more services in the future, but it says something about the power of early intervention. I think the thing that's hard for schools is he got a lot of intensity very early, and it's not feasible for public schools really to do that with every child who has he was getting like an hour a day for years, 1-to-1 with a teacher. And I know there is research in this area, more research that lets us predict, the level of intensity that a student might need to kind of make it more feasible for schools to meet the needs of a wider range of students. But he was an amazing student. He could spell better than my undergrads. He was, yeah.
Fantastic. Like you say, power of good intervention.
That's right. Right. Done early and
yes.
Done with a sufficient level of intensity.
So you've really got me thinking about something, as I know we need to wrap up because we've had you for a while. We could go on all day, by the way. This has been fantastic. We are aware you have other things to do. But I was just going to say, what are some of the challenges that are facing us now that we have a lot of this good information? A lot of states now have legislation that is very helpful as well. There's more information. More people understand what you mean when you say structured literacy. But what are some of the challenges we face in the future moving forward we should be aware of?
I think that maybe this is partly just, the fact that I've had this long-term interest in teacher prep. I still think teacher prep is a major challenge, particularly in relation to pre-service and particularly in relation to general educators who are more often have kind of a, constructivist, explicit teaching is bad, that kind of orientation and making good, although as I said earlier, I do think there's been improvement, making those good teacher prep practices more systemic. So that wherever you go to get your teacher training, just like if you're a doctor, whatever medical school you go to, they're not going to teach you that bad humors in the body cause disease. They're going to teach you about, antiseptic technique and germs and that sort of thing. I think that, doing that is really important. And I think, to kind of credit my teacher prep colleagues, because teacher preparation can be a really challenging job. I found it really rewarding, and I never, ever regretted going into the field. But there's a lot of challenges in terms of things like my article for Perspectives was on the how. Well, doing the how really requires demonstration, modeling, having candidates work with children under supervision, and there need to be supports for that. And also, ideally, you really need teachers in the field who've been well trained, because you don't want the teacher candidate seeing a teacher who's modeling, guessing at words or word shapes or something like that. So,
Louise, this has been delightful. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. I had a great time. It was great talking with you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And thank you to those of you who've been listening to our podcast. And I know that you will especially love this one. So please join us next time for the next episode of Literacy Talks.
Thanks for joining us today. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where literacy momentum begins. Visit readinghorizons.com/literacy talks to access episodes and resources to support your journey in the science of reading.